The presentation which you are about to receive is on two individuals, W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, which this video will be looking at somewhat short biographies and comparing their views on education. These are these two prominent leaders. On the left, you can see Booker T. Washington, and on the right, W.E.B. Du Bois. These two African Americans are going to shape the education system for themselves and also for every other person and American after. That both of them take education as the most important factor for their race. But the idea on the path that they take in education, that is, they must go one way or the other. The next slide is on, as you can see in front of you, and the picture is W.E.B. Du Bois, as his full name, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. William Edward Burghardt Du Bois was born in 1868 in Great Barlington, Massachusetts. When we look back at him, we think of him as an American sociologist, historian, civil rights activist, Pan-Africanist, author, and editor. Of course, W.E.B. Du Bois written many works in his lifetime, but for the sake of this video, we'll be focused on one in which some people may be familiar with, is The Souls of Black Folk, which was published in 1903. And also, even though he was one of the founding members of the NAACP, and on the NAACP, he was the editor of the Crisis magazine, which was of course owned by the NAACP. Du Bois's early life. He lived a great life in the beginning. He, of course, his town and himself was middle class, and there was a mixture of African Americans and non-African Americans within his home. And of course, so his upbringing had a good education. And eventually, through his elementary and education in high school, many in those times, not everybody would do to high school, or in his sense, African Americans at some point sometimes would not continue to higher education or finish high school. But of course, his education was simply a very formal but good education. In The Souls of Black Folk, his book, which I mentioned before, he brings up a memory which to him is to of some importance. And he says, and Du Bois says, I remember well when the shadow swept across me. In a wee wooden schoolhouse, something put it into the boys' and girls' heads to buy gorgeous visiting cards, 10 cents a package, and exchange. The exchange was merry, until one girl, a tall newcomer, refused my card, refused it with a glance. Then it dawned upon me, with a certain suddenness, that I was different from the others, or like, mayhap, in heart and life and longing, but shut out from their world by a vast veil. Du Bois, 1903. During after his education, W.E.B. Du Bois attended university, which, of course, he attended Fisk University for his undergrad education in the year of 1885, and he graduated in 1888. In that same year, of the fall of 1888, he attended Harvard University for his Master's of Education until he graduated in 1892. After that, he spent some time He actually studied in the University of Berlin from the years 1892 to 1894. And during this time, he was educated in many great deals, and also he met one of the most influential sociologists, Max Weber. And at points, they would have conversations and they would exchange letters, and to a point where they would simply have this relationship. But after, in 1894, Du Bois left Germany and University of Berlin, and he went back to Harvard to finish his education. And in the year of 1895, W.E.B. Du Bois became the first African American to receive his PhD from Harvard University. The next individual is Booker Taliaferro Washington, which is always known as Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was born April 5th, 1856, in Franklin County, Virginia. He was an American educator, author, orator, and advisor. Of course, he himself has written great works, as much as I mentioned from the previous individual, but the one we'll focus on for this presentation is one of his great works, Up from Slavery, written in 1901. And what he is known for is that he created to an extent and founded Tuskegee Institute. Booker's early life was that he was born into slavery. He wasn't free until the age of 9, when soldiers came and said to them that they were free. But for him, he found it very odd, and many of his people, of course. But eventually, yes, they were free. They would move. In his young age, he worked in a coal mine. And while working in the coal mine, eventually he would hear about his idea of this colored school, which excited him. Eventually, he would attend the day school they had, and also he would attend the night school for his education. But due to over time, he would have to not be able to attend his day school and simply just juggle his other education and with his work. And looking at his education was a mix of school and self-taught. Because Booker goes back to a memory when he first received a book. I induced my mother to get a hold of a book for me. She procured an old copy of Webster's Blueback Spelling Book, which contained the alphabets followed, such as meaningless words as ab, ba, sa, da. In that sense, I began at once to devour this book, and I think that it was the first one I've ever had in my hands. Washington, 1901. Booker T. Washington's education was that he attended the Hampton Institution from 1872 to 1875. And with his education he had received, he was able to go into more trades, which this institution was built around that concept. So, on the idea of education, when looking at W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, when you think of Du Bois, in a sense, his education is academic based. And when looking at Booker T. Washington's education, he has a vocational based education. So basically, what that means is that Washington's education is more a trade school, which was maybe in Canada you go to a school that teaches you carpentry, trades, that type of thing. So for Washington, he would study blacksmithing, carpentry, bricklaying, agriculture. His education still had academic components to it, but they were simply to do these trades. That's what they were built around. As for Du Bois, his education, he studied Latin, Greek, English, chemistry, and physics. Looking at Du Bois's education, simply it's a classical education. And looking at Washington, his education is a practical education. And simply their ideal philosophy is that Du Bois is an intellectual-oriented philosophy, and Washington's is more of a technical-oriented philosophy. But in a sense, Du Bois's education is simply what you would look at as an example as university, or if you're in the States, I guess they would refer to as colleges. But like the idea of like you get your bachelor of arts degree, eventually you were to continue, get your master's and PhD, is simply what similar to what we look at as Du Bois' education. And as Washington, his education simply is you go to a trade school to be carpenter, bricklayer, anything like those trade schools is his education. That's what the difference is between their education. When looking at both, of course, both guys have their own reasons on which they perceive to be the best education. You have to think, Du Bois took the formal educational routes because he looked at it as the only way to advance the race, his people. In that the reason why is if they have a formal education, they cannot be enslaved again. And for Washington, he had a few reasons why, because one, he thought that this vocational education or trade-based education was the way of the future for his people. And that, of course, he also was a product of it because he was raised in that education. And also that Mr. Washington felt that basically for his fellow brethren, his African American people, that this could help them instead of being no jobs, simple laborers, and very poor, that if he gives them education, that they can better themselves and not be poor, and that they would have a job, maybe a carpenter or a blacksmith or anything in between or above. That's what he believed. And simply, Mr. Washington thought that the idea that African American taking a university education that the mainstream American society would not allow. But simply because in those days it was a white society. Nothing more, nothing less. And that within this white society was all what they would allow for his people. And he didn't want to step the boundaries because they might take everything away. So he played his cards. When looking at both their education, which we mentioned in the previous slide, is that Du Bois had a very formal education. He would know languages, Greek, very academic-based education. And Booker T. Washington had a more vocational education, such as trade school. But you got to think too, the reason why they became this, their backgrounds molded the people who they became. For W.E. Du Bois, like I mentioned before, he had a good education. He went to elementary school, he finished high school, and eventually he went into university. And when we think about back at Mr. Washington, he really didn't sense school wasn't a priority because he had to work. And when he got to that stage of further education, their formal education, Du Bois got many degrees. As Mr. Washington went to this institute to learn trade school, to learn trades. You can see that their backgrounds influenced their education, and what the education they either received influences how they look at education as a whole. They both believe education is important. As Du Bois goes on the left side of the road, Booker T goes on the right. Both view education as important, but they take different paths on the idea on which education should take, and simply that we are the same way, where maybe when your parents may ask you, or somebody guardian, they'll ask you when you get that age, oh, are you going to go to university or are you going to go to college? What I mean by college is trade school. And you sit there and think, do I go to university or simply do I go to trade school? And in a sense, that old argument between W.E.B. Du Bois and Mr. Washington is still kind of going on today, is simply not to the extent it was, but either taking one or the other.